The rain poured heavily that night, an unrelenting melody of droplets striking the concrete and metallic rooftops of the city. Ethan Hayes' watch read 10:45 p.m., but time felt slower as he sprinted through the deserted streets, trying to reach the last station of the day, Station Hollow. The glow of the streetlights reflected in the puddles, creating distortions that resembled shadows dancing. Ethan, a 35-year-old journalist with the weary expression of someone who had seen more than he cared to, clutched his worn, battered portfolio like an anchor. He was frustrated. The investigation into the recent disappearances plaguing his city, which he had been pursuing for months, remained fruitless. A possible witness's name, a disconnected phone number, and nothing more. The mystery seemed to mock his efforts. Turning a corner, he finally spotted the entrance to Station Hollow, a small station on the outskirts of town that felt forgotten by time. While other stations have been modernized with escalators and digital signage, Station Hollow seemed to resist progress. Its tiles were worn, and the flickering street lamps buzzed incessantly. As soon as he stepped into the station, Ethan felt an immediate unease. No one was there, not even a staff member. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant echo of his own footsteps. He glanced at the large clock above the platform. 11:11 p.m. Odd. He was certain it wasn't that late yet. Suddenly, the muffled sound of an approaching train broke the stillness. Ethan turned quickly and saw something unexpected. An old-fashioned train gliding smoothly along the tracks. There was no screech of metal on metal, just a faint, almost inaudible whisper. Its side bore the number 11, and the sign simply read, "Final stop." The train came to a halt, and the doors slid open with a soft hiss. A thin mist spilled out from within, mingling with the damp night air. Ethan hesitated. Something about the train deeply unsettled him, but the pouring rain outside urged him to step in. The interior of the train was dimly lit by faint yellow lamps, some flickering sporadically. The walls were lined with an odd material, almost luminous, yet weathered by time. Rows of seats stretched out, most of them empty. The few passengers on board sat motionless, either staring blankly into space or fixated on the floor. Ethan chose a seat near the window. He opened his portfolio, intending to review his notes, but soon noticed something strange. The window was clouded with a mist that seemed to seep from outside. He tried wiping it away with his jacket sleeve, but the mist didn't budge. In fact, it seemed to thicken, slowly consuming the entire pane of glass. He checked his phone. No signal, no bars, no network. Stranger still, the time on his phone displayed 11:11 p.m., the same as the station clock. He attempted to manually adjust the time, but the screen froze. His unease grew. Footsteps echoed down the train's aisle, and Ethan looked up. A tall, thin man dressed in an antiquated uniform was slowly walking toward him. He held a small metal puncher attached to a chain. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were cold, almost vacant. "Ticket," the man said, his voice low and rasping. Ethan handed over his ticket without question. The man punched it with the tool, leaving a small hole in a shape Ethan didn't recognize. The ticket was returned, and the man moved on without a glance back. The train began to move. Too smoothly, Ethan noticed. He glanced out the window again, but there was nothing beyond the mist. No scenery, no buildings. Just an endless gray void stretching infinitely. Something was definitely wrong. He felt a chill crawl up the back of his neck, as though he were being watched. He glanced around, but the few passengers remained motionless, like statues. Ethan tried to rationalize the situation, but his instincts screamed that this was no ordinary train. The train glided forward in eerie silence, its motion so seamless that Ethan barely felt the vibrations. Even so, the unease was palpable. He turned away from the window, now completely opaque with mist, and focused on the other passengers. Something about them was profoundly unsettling. A middle-aged man sat slouched in one of the seats, his head bowed and shoulders hunched. muttering something inaudible. An older woman clutched a pair of faded child's gloves, her trembling fingers stroking the fabric as if it were a cherished treasure. Ethan watched, intrigued, but when he attempted to approach, the passengers seemed to recoil. It was as if his presence disturbed them. Determined to find answers, Ethan stood up and began walking down the aisle. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the flickering lamps. He passed 2 empty compartments before reaching the third, where he spotted a young woman sitting alone. She had dark brown hair pulled into a messy bun and was staring intently at a notebook in her hands. "Hey!" Ethan called out, trying not to startle her. "Do you know where this train is heading?" The woman looked up abruptly. Her eyes were a striking green, but they were shadowed by deep circles, as if she hadn't slept in days. She seemed surprised, almost alarmed, that someone had spoken to her. "You shouldn't be here," she said at last, her voice low and urgent. "I didn't have much of a choice," Ethan replied, gesturing toward the mist-covered window. "What is this place? What kind of train is this?" She studied him for a moment before sighing and motioning to the seat across from her. "Sit down. I don't have all the answers, but I can tell you what I know." Ethan obliged, feeling a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The woman closed a notebook and set it on her lap. He noticed its pages were covered in scribbles, diagrams, and words that made no sense. "My name is Claire," she began, "and from what I can tell, this train isn't supposed to exist." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, leaning forward. Claire ran a hand through her hair, clearly frustrated. "I boarded it. I don't know how long ago. It could be weeks, months, maybe even years. Time doesn't make sense here. All I know is, once you're on, you don't get off. Not without facing it. Before Claire could respond, the train gave a slight jolt and the lights flickered. The air around them grew colder, and Ethan felt an icy shiver run down his spine. He turned to look down the aisle and saw something moving in the darkness. A tall, slender figure emerged from the shadows, draped in a black cloak that seemed to flow like smoke. Its face was hidden behind a smooth, white mask devoid of features, faintly reflecting the dim light of the train. The figure moved silently, its feet appearing to hover above the floor. Claire gripped Ethan's arm tightly. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling with terror. "The Shadow Keeper." "Who?" Ethan asked, his eyes locked on the figure, which now advanced slowly toward the passengers. "He controls the train," Claire explained, her voice shaking. "He knows why we're here. He knows what we've done." "What are you talking about?" Ethan asked, the fear in his chest mounting. "We all have shadows, Ethan," she said, her gaze fixed on the figure. "Guilt, regret, things we'd rather forget. He sees them, and they keep us trapped here." The figure stopped beside the middle-aged man, who was now curled up in his seat, his murmurs growing louder. The Shadow Keeper leaned down, his mask close to the man's ear. No one else seemed to move or breathe. Suddenly, the man began to sob. Tears streamed down his face as he shook his head frantically. "No, please no." With a soft, dry snap, the man vanished. There were no screams, no drama, just a faint puff, as if he had never been there. The Shadow Keeper straightened and slowly turned his masked face toward Ethan and Claire. "Run," Claire whispered, tugging at Ethan's arm. They bolted down the aisle, passing through 2 compartments before slamming the door to a luggage car behind them. The air was heavy, and both of them gasped for breath. "What was that?" Ethan asked, leaning against a pile of suitcases. "The Shadow Keeper," Claire replied, wiping a hand across her face. "He only shows up when you're close to breaking the rules." "Breaking the rules?" Claire nodded. "The train has its own rules. Don't talk too much, don't ask too many questions, and never, ever be alone." The silence in the luggage car was unnerving, broken only by the muffled sound of their ragged breathing. The overhead light flickered, casting distorted shadows across the stacks of abandoned luggage. Ethan tried to steady his breathing while Claire moved toward the single window in the compartment, which, like all the others, was cloaked in opaque mist. "Does he know we're here?" Ethan asked, his voice low and tense. "He always knows," Claire said without turning around. She seemed to be watching something in the window, though there was only the gray void outside. But the Keeper doesn't always attack. He waits. He gives us choices. Ethan frowned. "Choices? What do you mean?" Claire turned to face him, her green eyes a mix of fear and resolve. "Everyone on this train is here for a reason. Something holds us, something we can't move past, and the train feeds on it." She paused, pressing her lips together. The Keeper is its voice. He appears when you're about to make a choice that matters. Before Ethan could respond, he noticed something on the floor of the compartment. An old, partially torn ticket wedged between two suitcases. He picked it up, examining the yellowed, worn paper. The words were faded, but one phrase was still legible. "The exit lies in the shadows you fear." He held the ticket up to Claire. "Have you seen anything like this before?" She glanced at the paper and nodded slowly. "There are messages like this all over the train. I don't know who left them, but they always point to the same thing. You have to face what's hidden." A chill crept up Ethan's spine, but before he could ask another question, he heard something coming from the corridor. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, each one echoing like thunder in the silence. Claire's eyes widened as she motioned for him to stay quiet. The train reveals more of its secrets. They squeeze behind a stack of suitcases, trying to stay out of sight. Ethan clutched the ticket tightly, his fingers damp with sweat. As the footsteps stopped just outside the door, the air grew icy, as if the Shadow Keeper's presence was sucking the warmth from the room. Claire whispered, "He can't come in here without a reason, if we stay quiet." But before she could finish, a sharp, metallic sound pierced the air. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the Keeper's silhouette. He stood motionless, his mask faintly glowing under the flickering light. Even without a face, Ethan felt the weight of invisible eyes scanning the compartment. Suddenly, a suitcase tumbled from a nearby stack, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. The Keeper tilted his head, almost as if intrigued. He stepped forward and Ethan's heart raced. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but Claire gripped his arm firmly, whispering, "No." He senses fear. "Don't show fear." The Keeper lingered for what felt like an eternity before finally retreating. The door closing behind him, relief washed over them. But the silence left behind was even more unsettling. The hidden journal. After a few tense minutes, Claire stood up and began rummaging through the luggage. Ethan watched, puzzled. "What are you doing?" "Looking," she said without pausing. "There are things hidden here, things people left behind." Finally, she found something, a leather-bound journal, its pages torn and stained with ink. She flipped it open and began scanning through it, her eyes catching scattered words. Ethan leaned closer, intrigued. "What does it say?" he asked. "Stories," Claire replied, frowning. "It looks like someone tried to document the train. Look at this." She pointed to a page where phrases were scrawled. "The Keeper tests us, but he is not the true enemy. With each cycle, the guilt grows stronger. The clock measures more than time. It is the key." Ethan glanced at the clock high above the compartment. It was still frozen at 11:11 p.m. He was beginning to sense that time on the train was more symbolic than real. "And here," Claire continued, pointing to another phrase, "the truth lies in the last car." Ethan frowned. "The last car? I thought this train didn't have an end." Claire shrugged. "I've never made it that far. Maybe that's what the Keeper is guarding. The train's rules." As they moved deeper into the train, trying to reach the last car, Ethan and Claire noticed the train changing in response to their actions. The cars seemed to stretch, with doors appearing where none had been before, as they confronted their fears and painful memories. They also began to understand the train's rules. Never walk alone. Passengers who strayed from the group vanished more quickly. Don't trust the shadows. They whispered truths mixed with lies, attempting to manipulate their actions. The clock matters. Each appearance of the Shadow Keeper seemed synchronized with the final minutes before midnight. Ethan's vision. At one point, Ethan froze in his tracks. In the shattered reflection of a broken window, he saw himself, but younger. He was in a room filled with boxes and documents. He realized he was witnessing the day he ruined the life of a fellow journalist, planting false evidence to secure an exclusive story. Guilt hit him like a wave. He dropped to his knees, gasping for air. Claire tried to pull him back to reality, but he seemed trapped. I did this, he murmured. I made this happen, and that's exactly what the train wants you to see, Claire said, tugging him back to his feet. But you can't let it consume you. If you do, it wins. The strange train cars. Ethan and Claire pressed on, each car stranger than the last. The rows of seats were now completely empty, but odd objects were scattered throughout. An old typewriter, a pair of children's boots, even a cracked mirror that reflected something different from the rest of the car. The mist outside had grown denser, almost alive, pressing against the windows as though trying to seep in. The sound of the train gliding along the tracks was fading, replaced by an eerie silence that amplified their every step. We're close, Claire murmured, her eyes fixed on the horizon of empty cars ahead. How do you know? Ethan asked, still clutching the leather journal they had found in the luggage compartment. Because he's here, Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan felt the presence before he even turned his head. The air turned icy, and the dim yellow light in the car began flickering violently. He turned and saw the Shadow Keeper standing at the far end of the corridor. This time, the figure didn't move slowly. Instead, it advanced purposefully, each step a silent threat. Run, Claire shouted, grabbing Ethan's arm. The car of reflections. They burst through the door into the next car, slamming it shut behind them. But the Shadow Keeper continued to advance, faster than before. When they turned to take in their surroundings, they realized this car was unlike any they had encountered. The walls were lined with mirrors, both large and small, each reflecting not only Ethan and Claire, but something more. Fragments of memories, distorted scenes from events they hadn't lived, but that felt eerily familiar. Ethan caught his reflection in one of the mirrors. He was sitting at a bar table, a glass of whiskey in hand. Beside him, a woman he didn't recognize was crying, pointing at a stack of torn papers. Is this real? He asked, his voice trembling. They're your shadows, Claire said, her gaze fixed on another mirror. She saw a child, perhaps 5 years old, hiding under a table as a man yelled in the background. She quickly looked away, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The train is showing us what we want to forget. Why? Before she could answer, the reflections began to move independently. In the mirrors, their versions started speaking. Ethan's reflection said, "You knew it was wrong, and you did it anyway." "That's not true," Ethan replied, his voice rising. "You ruined lives, and now you think you can escape without paying the price." Claire tried to pull him back to reality. This is what it does. Don't listen. But Ethan was frozen, staring at his reflection as it moved closer to the mirror's surface, as if it could step out at any moment. The Shadow Keeper entered the car, each of his steps echoing like thunder. The difficult choice. The Shadow Keeper stopped between them, his presence dominating the space. He extended a hand toward Claire, pointing at her with a slow, deliberate gesture. "Choose," said a deep, reverberating voice that seemed to come from everywhere. "Choose what?" Ethan shouted, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Her or you," the keeper responded. Claire stepped back, shaking her head. "No, Ethan, don't believe him. That's what he wants. It doesn't matter who he chooses. The guilt is what keeps us here. If you give in, you'll never leave." Ethan stood frozen, his hands trembling. I can't. The lights began to go out, one by one, until the car was plunged into total darkness. Only the mirrors remained illuminated, reflecting the most painful moments of their lives. Ethan once again saw the face of the colleague he had destroyed, the look of betrayal, the silent scream. Confronting the truth, Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the reflections. He remembered the journal and the words he had read. The exit lies in the shadows you fear. Suddenly, it clicked. The train isn't about escaping, he said, more to himself than to Claire. It's about facing what we've done. Ethan turned to the Shadow Keeper. You want the truth? Then here it is. The Keeper paused, tilting his head slightly as if listening. Ethan began to speak, confessing aloud what he had done. The fabricated article, the life he had ruined, the career he had stolen. Every word felt like it was tearing him apart, but he kept going, letting the truth pour out. When he finished, the Shadow Keeper took a step back. His hands trembled, and the mask he wore began to crack, revealing a radiant light beneath it. What's happening? Claire asked, but Ethan didn't answer. He knew he had done what was needed. The liberation. The train began to shake violently, as though it were falling apart. The mist outside cleared, revealing a golden sunrise that seemed impossibly bright. The car doors slid open, and Ethan realized he and Claire were back where it all began, Station Hollow. But something was different. The clock now read 6 a.m., and the train behind them was slowly fading into the distance. Claire looked at Ethan, a mix of relief and sorrow on her face. You did it. You broke the cycle. What about you? Ethan asked. She gave him a faint smile. I still have shadows to face. With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing before he could stop her. Ethan stood on the platform, the sunlight warming his face as he gazed at the horizon. Ethan remained on the platform for a long moment, staring at the empty space where the train had vanished. The relief he had expected never fully came. Instead, he felt an odd emptiness, as though something was still watching him. The gentle morning light began to wash over Station Hollow, but strangely, the place still felt deserted. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the torn ticket he had taken from the train. But now, instead of being faded and illegible, new words had appeared, written in dark, precise handwriting. You face your shadows, but they never truly disappear. Ethan frowned, tightening his grip on the ticket. He thought about what Claire had said before she vanished. I still have shadows to face. Was this ticket a reminder that, even after escaping the train, people are never completely free from their past? As he pondered this, an unexpected sound caught his attention. It was the low, rhythmic hum of a train approaching. He looked toward the horizon and saw another train sliding along the tracks. This one was different, modern, clean, with transparent windows that revealed ordinary passengers scrolling through their phones or reading books. For a moment, Ethan considered boarding, but something inside him held him back. Not again, he muttered to himself, stepping away. The weight of consequences. Ethan began walking through the empty streets surrounding the station. There was a nagging feeling that something was out of place. Every corner looked familiar, but slightly off, as if the world around him had subtly shifted. The street signs were written in different fonts. The storefronts appeared more worn than he remembered, and the few people he passed avoided making eye contact. He checked his phone, which now displayed a normal time, 6:15 a.m., yet the device still felt strange. Opening the browser, he typed in the name of a city, expecting to see familiar news, but the results were confusing. Places he knew now had different names. Historical events seemed altered, and even the newspaper where he worked no longer appeared to exist. That's when Ethan realized he hadn't returned to the same world. Perhaps the train had brought him back to an altered version of reality, one where his actions carried even greater consequences. The echo of the train. As Ethan walked, he began to hear something strange, the same faint vibration he had heard on the train. He looked around but saw nothing. The sound grew louder, like a persistent whisper following him. In the reflection of a storefront window, he saw something that made him freeze. For a brief moment, the shadow keeper stood behind him, as still as a living shadow. When he turned around, the space was empty, but the sensation of being watched lingered. He recalled the words on the ticket. Shadows never truly disappear. A new journey. Ethan reached the old building where he lived. The front door looked worn but functional. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. Entering his apartment, everything appeared as it had before, but on the table lay an envelope he didn't remember leaving there. With trembling hands, he opened it. Inside was a photo of Claire smiling, though her eyes held something strange, a glimmer of familiarity he couldn't shake. On the back of the photo was a single phrase written in bold, dark letters. You may have left the train, but it never truly leaves you. The final sound. As Ethan sat on the couch, trying to process everything, the familiar sound of the train echoed again, this time louder. He turned toward the window and saw the mist creeping closer, slow and inevitable, like a gray tide swallowing the world outside. The clock on his wall flickered, 11:11 p.m., and then everything went dark.
Like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. Like and subscribe.
Ele